Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Mark Allen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyour-ear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
Well, welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. Now, the music press barely exists anymore, but I can remember starting at the NME in 1977 and thinking, this is the greatest job in the world. At which point, some old lag said to me, you should have been here in the old days, mate, and painted this picture of the unimaginable largesse and being ferried around in Led Zeppelin's private plane. And it's precisely the lost world that is recreated in just Backdated by Chris Charlesworth about Chris's 7 years at the Melody Maker in the 1970s. Chris, lovely to see you again.
Nice to see you, Mark.
So did you think at the time, this is unimaginably wonderful, or did you only realise how extraordinary it was in hindsight?
I think I took it for granted at the time, to a certain extent anyway.
Yeah.
Only because there were so many other people doing the same job, not just on Melody Maker, but on NME, Sound, Disc and Record Mirror. But now, when I look back, it seems unfathomable that we had so much access to rock stars, and also that the weekly music press in the UK had so much power.
Oh, it's just extraordinary. So just remind us how you got to the NME in the first place. I mean, how did you get that job?
Like a lot of my colleagues on MM, I trained to be a newspaper reporter. I left school and I became a trainee reporter on a local weekly newspaper up in West Yorkshire, where I was brought up. Then I moved to an evening paper in Bradford, the Telegraph and Argus, and it was there that I started to write a pop column. It was called
called the Swing Section. Was that right? That's right. Yeah.
It sounds incredibly cheesy now, doesn't it?
That really dates it, doesn't it?
Yeah, the Swing Section, and I did this for a couple of years, and actually I moved down south to another evening paper that was published in Slough and Windsor area, and it was while I was on that paper that I saw an ad in the back pages of Melody Maker and applied for a job. I should point out that along the way here, I'd become a huge rock and pop fan. I'd played the guitar in a couple of amateur bands up in Yorkshire, and I was building a record collection, going to see bands whenever I could. And I suppose that if I had a hobby, it was rock and pop music.
Well, fair enough. You were clearly in the right job. But describe the office. There's a brilliant detail early on where you talk about Max Jones, who I can still remember, who was the kind of jazz critic. Actually, he was on the Melody Maker when you joined. And Max Jones was a conscientious objector in World War II and wore a beret. And I think it had a fling with...
Well, Max was completely bald, of course. I gather he lost his hair as a result of some trauma that may or may not have involved female people early on in his life. And thereafter, he always wore this almost like a skull cap type beret on his head. Max was a great old character, of course, and he was indeed a conscientious objector. And it's believed that he had a relationship, as they call it, with Billie Holiday when she came to the UK.
Well, that's very impressive.
But Max was a wonderful old guy. He was always complaining about something or other as well. And he spent most of his day in El Vino's, which was a wine bar on the other side of Fleet Street. MM's offices at the time were in this great big building with lots of other magazines, farming magazines, football magazines. And there was one called Laundry and Dry Cleaning News, which I figure must be the dullest magazine in the world, really.
Yeah. That's fantastic. But it just the idea that there was somebody, you're working with somebody who could have fought in World War II just connects it back to an old world. It's amazing, really.
Max wasn't the only one. There was a guy called Laurie Henshaw. What you have to bear in mind is that Melody Maker was first published in 1926. And for most of its long music throughout the 30s and 40s. It wasn't until Elvis arrived that it started covering rock and roll. And at first, it was a bit sniffy about rock and roll, too, because it was very much allied, I think, to the Musicians' Union. And the Musicians' Union thought that rock and roll would put all the professional trumpet players and what have you out of a job, which it probably did. So Melody Maker took the side of the union and was very, very critical of rock and roll. So it's terrible music. It'll never last. Things changed with the Beatles, though.
Yeah, and I can remember when I was at NME, there was a kind of rumor that in order to work at Melody Maker, I don't know if it's true or not, actually, in the early 70s, you had to be a musician because the editor...
as it happened, some of us were, in an amateur way, but that wasn't a requirement for the job.
Wasn't a requirement.
No. I mean, Chris Welsh played the drums, Richard Williams played the drums, I played the guitar a bit, so did Roy Hollingworth. I don't think Michael Watts did. Michael Watts fancied himself as a saxophone player, actually, but I think his wife once got him a saxophone for Christmas. It was underneath the tree, he told me.
Well, you don't need to play the saxophone, you just need to pose and just hang around, smoke heavily and just look insouciant. Absolutely. But there was an intense rivalry with the NME at the time, and we always kind of felt that the Melody Maker were the square ones. Did you have a sense of that?
I think so, yes. Because of Melody Maker's past, there was always a sense on the part of the staff that we ought to admire musicianship. So those musicians who were clearly skilled on their instruments were the ones we liked, and the ones that weren't particularly skilled were the ones that we took a bit of a, sniffy attitude towards. That did change as the 70s progressed, of course.
Yeah.
But MM sort of had a reputation for enjoying those bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. This was partly down to Chris Welsh, of course, who loved that kind of music. But I think we were slow to change, in fact, in the mid-70s, whereas NME was more on the ball. But for the first 3 years of the 70s, we were certainly outselling NME big time.
Well, you were selling, if I remember right, you sold about 200,000 copies a week. And I think the music press in total sold something like nearly 600,000, which is just incredible.
It's extraordinary when you think it doesn't exist now, Mark. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And this brought with it a certain amount of power because the music industry needed the music press to inform record buyers and fans what was going on. There was no internet. Nobody had computers. No one had websites. So in order to find out when Led Zeppelin were performing, you had to read MM or NME or Sounds or whatever. It was the only way to get news about your favorite rock act.
But also, it's what constituted a news story is so interesting. And even when I was at the NME in the late 70s, just the title tracks of a record yet to come out would be a front page splash.
Absolutely. You see, you couldn't look this up on Google, could you?
No.
Key in, Led Zeppelin or I don't know, whoever, Sex Pistols, it doesn't matter, on Google and find out what was going on.
But I remember going to gigs and not having any idea of what the band I was going to see looked like, which is an amazing thing, really. You'd see all the instruments set up and the microphones and the equipment. You'd kind of work out what kind of a band they might be and what the lineup might be, but you didn't know what they looked like because you'd never seen them.
Unless you'd seen their pictures in the music press.
Yeah.
You'd take a group like, I don't know, Pink Floyd. They never had their pictures on the front of their LP sleeves, did they? And for that matter, it was difficult to see what it looked like anyway, because the Pink Floyd only played on a dark stage. So the only way was to look at Barry Wenzel's pictures in Melody Maker.
That's right.
Or whoever, Ali Smith, who was pictures in NME. It was, and because of this, the musicians were very open to us. They sort of welcomed us. Well, most of them did into their company because they needed us. Now they don't need the music press at all. That
press was the way you got a record deal. The press was the way you got on the radio. It was the way you got on television. It was absolutely crucial. There's a bit where you mentioned.
I was the news editor for 3 years. Shortly after I joined, Ray Coleman, the editor, made me the news editor, and I think everything was a lot more immediate in those days. Acts put out a lot more music, and they toured a lot more than they seem to do now. If you say, Elton John put out something like 10 LPs between 1970 and 1976, I think. And if you look at the career of someone big now, say take Coldplay. I think I'm right. They started around 2000, and have they put out 10 albums yet?
Well, it's unlike, things moved at an absolutely incredible place. I mean,
Yeah.
two albums a year.
So it's taken Coldplay more than twice as long to put out half as many albums. Is it 4 times as long? You see.
Yeah.
And because of this, there was always news. This group's going on the road, this group's splitting up, this guitarist leaving that band to join another band. And I was responsible for covering all this news.
But you get an idea of the power of the press when at one point, I think you'd said in a review that Led Zeppelin's popularity were waning. And I think, didn't they take out an ad in Melody Maker?
Yeah. This was,
what did they say?
Led Zeppelin could be very touchy, as a lot of people found out who were in my position. I suggested that because they hadn't toured the UK for over 12 months, their popularity might have waned. I mean, that's all I said. Just because they hadn't toured for 12 months.
Yeah.
And they really took exception to this. They took out this ad in the following week's MM. Of course, they were just about to do a tour and it sold out, in 10 minutes or whatever. And they said, sell out, their popularity has waned. Chris Charlesworth, Melody Maker, they wrote on the ad, and Robert Plant even mentioned it on stage at a gig in Glasgow, apparently. He had a pop at me from the stage. So that's how touchy they were. But that's how important the press was.
That's how important the press was.
No, I think so. Not just how touchy you were. They were offended by that. Led Zeppelin, who you'd think were the most thick-skinned bunch around, they were offended that I'd really...
Well, Led Zeppelin are an interesting case because particularly, with the Enemy, but particularly with Rolling Stone, they had a very difficult relationship because they were so popular. And all these rock critics kind of took a very snooty view of what they were doing and their exploitation of old blues and just thought it was kind of music for 14-year-olds. And nobody was very fond of them, really.
That's right. I mean, the thing is, I think a lot... this is a point I try to make in my book. A lot of American rock critics, they sought, like you might say, a deeper meaning in their rock music. And Led Zeppelin, they regarded as being trivial in terms of their philosophy. They were very skilled, but their lyrics didn't say very much. Yeah, this was one of the reasons why they didn't like Led Zeppelin. Also, they thought that Led Zeppelin were only in it for the money. Which meant they were breadheads, and American rock critics despised breadheads.
Breadheads. There can't be many people anywhere in the world having a conversation involving the word breadheads, but you and I are, and anybody listening would totally
you know
understand.
What I mean. I mean,
no, it's just so funny.
Now,
just so funny.
I don't know.
Didn't you? I think you did you were on the Led Zeppelin private plane with on the tour which Cameron Crowe was on. Was that right?
That's right. I remember Cameron and Neil Preston, the photographer.
Well, Cameron Crowe would have been, I guess, about 17 at the time. He's born in 1957,
Cameron
so
was
he's probably about
young.
17.
Cameron was very young compared to other Rolling Stone reporters, and he was the only one that on Rolling Stone that appeared to like Led Zeppelin. So he was invited on the tour with them. This was in 1975, when I was hanging around with them for 4 or 5 days, a whole week, and so I kind of got to know them a bit. Well, I already knew them because I'd seen them in the UK. This was when I was actually on the plane, the Starship, the famous Starship, and I sat behind the controls. I think a few people did, but I actually flew the plane. The pilot, I was sat next to the pilot playing with the joystick, So just a trivial thing. But
this does seem pretty extraordinary, doesn't it? So with Cameron Crowe, I mean, a lot of Almost Famous was based on his experiences. I think of actually touring with Led Zeppelin. Did you, when you saw the film, which I assume you must have done, did you see any kind of parallels with the things that were going on, the experiences you had?
A little bit, yeah. I think it was Lester Bangs was his. That was the writer that he looked up to. But I did see the parallels, and with the groupies and girls hanging around. I mean, this era, this was. I don't know. There was a lot more hedonism around, I think, in the 1970s. There was certainly, it was before there was any AIDS crisis. So everybody was a lot looser sexually, if you like, especially Led Zeppelin. But we didn't report on this. There was a kind of an unspoken agreement between the music writers, the British ones anyway, and the groups, that although we saw what went on after hours back in the hotels, all we covered was the music, really, and what the shows were like and that kind of thing. We never mentioned the drug taking, and we certainly didn't mention the adultery.
Well, when that all changed in the late 70s, the relationship between because the NME started writing about all the things that were going on, and that kind of unwritten rule had been broken, and actually the relationship between bands and the rock press and the bands really changed.
It deteriorated considerably. Yeah, it did deteriorate. I don't know whether that was a good or a bad thing. And after John Lennon's murder, everything changed completely. I think that the access to rock stars.
Yeah.
But certainly I had no trouble getting through to rock stars, and not just when they needed to promote a new record or, they were going on tour. So they didn't necessarily have anything to sell when we requested an interview. But because we were selling 200,000 copies a week, that everyone realized that we were powerful.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I don't think the music press has got much power at all. Most of it's nostalgic anyway. The latest issue of Mojo landed on my map the other day. It's got Bob Dylan on the cover, and the story inside is about his 1974 tour.
Well, that's fair enough. I mean, I sympathise. Having edited magazines until reasonably recently, the stuff that really sells
responsible for that. I know,
is going to be from the past.
But the point is, it wasn't nostalgic when we were writing about it. It was happening today,
no, of course,
next week or last week. Whereas now, most of Mojo and Uncut and that, it's all about the past. Somehow.
No, absolutely, and I can completely understand that. But did you feel that it was hard to write for the reader when you were in those situations where you're on Led Zeppelin's private plane or whatever, or were you writing for the band? Did you feel that you were compromised by that?
We were writing for the readers.
Yeah.
I wasn't writing for the band. In the case of Led Zeppelin, I think I had to watch my step slightly because they had a reputation as for being unpleasant towards those writers they didn't like. But they were an exception in this regard. Most groups welcomed us unequivocally, especially the Who, who became my sort of favorite band, if you like, and whom I got to know better than anyone else. No, we were writing for the readers, I think, and we knew what our readers wanted, and we gave it to them. The other thing I think I should point out here, we worked really hard. I was churning out 2 or 3 interviews a week and a couple of show reviews. As my book makes clear, after mid-1973, I worked in America for Melody Maker. This was a dream job.
Yeah, well, you were based in the West Coast and the East Coast,
yeah,
weren't you?
I started off in California, and then I lived in New York for 3 years working for MM, right?
But they
They
could have got an American correspondent, but I suppose the attraction was seeing America through British eyes, because at that time we were so enthralled by American pop culture. We'd read about it in books, we'd seen it in films, and it was just a dream to be living in the Chateau Marmont, where it was.
It was absolute. This was the best job in the world, I thought. Absolutely, in any field whatsoever, the best job in the world was to be Melody Maker's American correspondent, which was a full-time job, and you lived rent-free in a flat that was paid for by the owners of Melody Maker. And although this is a dream job, like I say, I did have to work hard. As I say, 2 or 3 interviews a week, rushing back to the flat, typing them up. There was no emails.
No, I don't doubt it.
You had to type everything up on like A4 paper, double space, make a carbon copy in case it got lost.
That's right, carbon copy.
And then do another one the next day and another one the next. And 2-3 nights a week, I'd be at shows writing reviews. I had to write a New York news column every week as well. So we worked very hard, even though it was a dream job.
No, you don't have to convince me of that.
Well, nowadays,
don't feel bad about it.
Looking at the music press now, it looks like 1 interview a month.
Yeah, but I wanted to mention just 2 or 3 people or incidents in the book which I thought were really interesting. One was that you were present at the incident at the Rainbow. I think it was in December 1971, when Frank Zappa was pushed off the stage and incredibly badly injured.
I love it.
Tell me what happened there.
Well, the thing about the Rainbow was I'd befriended the manager, and he'd given me this staff pass which said admit to all parts of theatre at all times. So I could go and watch every show there, go in the back door, the stage door, wander around the backstage anywhere I liked, and no one stopped me because I had this pass. So on the night of that Frank Zappa incident, he was doing 2 concerts, and I'd gone in for the second half of the first concert, and it was my intention to hang out in the backstage bar between concerts, maybe chat to someone or other, and then watch the whole of the next concert. Well, as it happened, at the end of the first concert, I'd wandered down the front, and I was sat at the side, so stood at the side where ushers sort of stand, security people. And I watched the whole thing. This bloke got up from his seat in the front row, and there was little steps at the side of the stage. He rushed on, got behind Frank, gave him a push, and they fell into the pit, obviously, with his guitar.
He fell a really long way onto solid concrete, didn't
it? Absolutely. And everybody was really shocked. What happened here? Right? This bloke tried to run off, but he was grabbed by the security people, who handed him over to Frank's people, who knows what they did to him. Anyway, meanwhile, Frank had been stretchered out of this pit down the front and was being carried out of the back door. But the Rainbow was a big venue. There were 3,500 people in it, 3,500 people in it. And because there were 2 shows, there were another 3,500 people waiting to get in for the second show. Now, a lot of these people thought that Frank had been killed. And this rumor spread around everyone, and they all went outside and said, "Oh, Frank's been killed, Frank's been killed." And because I could wander anywhere with this pass, I'd wandered out. I saw this huge crowd out in the road. I wandered back in. What's going on? What's going on? Of course, I was in a perfect position to see all this. It wasn't wholly responsible, but that was partly responsible for the Rainbow's closure, I think, because the manager, a guy called John Morris, he had to refund. Let's think, three shows at 3,500 people. He had to refund over £10,500 worth of tickets. Now that was a lot of money in those.
Huge amount of money.
And John, I remember him telling me that he needed to make between 30 and 40 grand a week just to keep even, right? Just to break even at the Rainbow. And when something like that happens, it really puts the kibosh on things.
Can you remember it also changed Zappa's relationship with this country, didn't he? He really was put off coming back here. But can you remember your headline of your piece?
No, I can't. Can you?
But I'm presuming it must have been to do with the fact
I can't remember it. I don't know. I can't remember. Interestingly enough, I managed to obtain scans of every single melody maker from the 1970s before I wrote this book. I couldn't look it up, actually. I do mention that in the book, but not my headline.
No, I just wondered what it was.
Zappa flawed, probably.
Zappa flawed.
Zappa out for the count.
Yeah. I think more than one occasion when you interviewed John Lennon when he was living with May Pang, which is very interesting. What impression did you get of his life at the time?
I got the impression that he was slightly lost. I was very lucky in that I managed to develop a bit of a relationship with John and interviewed him 3 times and saw him socially a bit. But in LA, it was pure chance that I bumped into him. He was in the Rainbow Bar and Grill, which you may have heard of there, which rock stars hang out, rock musicians' place. And a guy working for him called Tony King was there, and Tony used to work for Elton. And I thought Tony would have been with Elton, so I saw him at the bar. I said, "Is Elton here?" He said, "No, I'm working for John now. Would you like to meet him?" Would I like to meet him? Well, yes, please. You don't say no. No, I've got to go home early night tonight. And so he took me over, and I met John, and we chatted over a beer or 2. And the interesting thing was he seemed really pleased to talk to someone English. I
think he was quite homesick, wasn't he?
Yeah.
You missed English culture. And
he was asking me all these questions about the UK. And he was asking me all these questions about Paul, because I've seen Wings. And he was asking me to debrief him on what Wings were like and all that, which was kind of almost surreal. I know it's a bit cliche to say that, but to find myself in a position where I'm telling John Lennon about what Paul McCartney's up to was, I never thought that had happened when I was back home in Yorkshire. Anyway,
no, that's peculiar.
And so I just plucked up courage and said, "Can we do a proper interview?" Because I didn't have the tape recorder with me. on this occasion. And he said, yeah, come round to the house where I'm staying in a couple of days' time. So I did.
Yeah.
And so that interview, it wasn't arranged through PRs or anything, which I kind of liked that. I always like to be able to, sidestep the official channels, if you like.
It seems absolutely extraordinary now that you can get access to people without going through.
How many insulation?
And nobody's sitting in on the interview or controlling it anyway.
It's amazing. No, not in any way whatsoever.
No, it's incredible.
And so I went up to this house. I drove up to this house. He was staying in a house that was owned by the guy that ran Ode Records. I've forgotten his name now. Anyway, he used to manage the Mamas and the Papas. And it was a lovely bungalow up in Beverly Hills. And so we sat for a couple of hours outside by the pool, chatting away about he just put out mind games. And we were talking about his relationship with the other Beatles, his relationship with Yoko, his immigration problems, what kind of guitars he still played. I talked about everything I did. Really lovely interview it was. And that set the tone for all my subsequent sort of dealings with John over the next 3 years, because eventually this was when I'd moved to New York. I was at some event where he was at, and I asked him for his phone number, which is really cheeky when you think about it. You don't ask rock stars for their phone numbers. But I felt sufficiently, emboldened, if you like, by my relationship with him.
Did he give it to you?
And John said, I don't know what my number is, because Yoko's always changing it. And but if you send me a cable, which is like a telegram, to his address at the Dakota, to flat so-and-so, whatever, I've forgotten what it was now, it's in the book, but I promise I'll call you back if you put your phone number on. And that's what John did for the next 3 years. Whenever I wanted to get in touch with him, I
sent him a cable.
Dear John, please get in touch, Chris Melody Maker. My number is 212, whatever it was. And he'd ring up, and when he rang up, he'd say, hello, Chris, it's Johnny Beatle here. I love that. What do you want, Chris? It's Johnny Beatle. That's fantastic, right? And so I did other stories about him, when he got his green card. I talked about his immigration, when the Shaved Fish album, the rock and roll album, all that stuff. So I had a really nice, warm relationship with John. John wasn't one for a lot of standing on ceremony. I think he liked to bypass official channels as well. I think that he liked New York because he could walk around on the streets, which, alas, now in hindsight, you think he shouldn't have done, of course, but he liked the informality of a situation.
Well, he loved being with British people. I think he was homesick and very nostalgic.
He loved being with
life in the past. Yeah. There were various people that you saw very, very early on. Steely Dan and Blondie being really good examples. So Steely Dan, you were pretty much the first British journalist to interview them, is that right?
I think I don't know whether I was. I might have been the first to interview them in person. I don't know whether they'd done any on the phone. They started touring about 1974. Well, they toured before, but they were on their way to the UK, and they were doing some shows in New York, and that's why I went to interview them. I was a little bit... how can I say, trepidatious, that word, because I'd heard they were very intellectual and liked to play chess backstage or something.
Chess is an indication of intellect.
Think about it, some of their songs are about chess. Medieval Game and the Kings. There are chess references in their early records. But they were pretty sociable towards me. But I could tell they were on an intellectual level that was somewhat higher than some rock stars, let's say.
Yeah.
But they also had pretty strong opinions about who they liked and who they didn't like, and that they didn't mind expressing those opinions, or even if it offended someone or other. But I liked them a lot, and I saw them perform. And technically, they were fantastic. They were a little cold, maybe, but Blondie.
So you saw Debbie Harry when she was still in the stilettos, didn't you?
Well, I saw Debbie in this. This is thanks to when I was in New York, I became good friends with Bob Gruen, the photographer, and I was determined to cover this sort of downtown rock scene that was occurring around CBGB's in a place called the 82 Club. But I didn't really know how to go about it because there were no PRs helping you to do this. So I called Bob Gruen for a bit of help. Said what, and Bob suggested I join him at this club called the 82 Club, where this group, the Stilettos, were playing. So I went down there and saw them, and I was in the midst of writing, and what I wanted to do was to write a piece about a lot of these bands all in one story. I like the Ramones, Talking Heads, the Dictators, or maybe one or two others. Television was one, and the Voidoids, but they came after two. But I wanted to cover them all in one story, and I stuck the Stilettos in the same story. Anyway, this 82 Club, Gruen introduced me to Debbie. And of course, she was like Miss World, she's so beautiful. And I did a very quick chat with her, and Gruen took some pictures of her. And this was included in a piece that appeared in MM in the spring of 1974. And this would be the first mention of Debbie Harry in any British newspaper anywhere ever. And after it came out, I got in touch with Debbie and showed it, and she said she wanted to see it because she was really excited about having a picture in a British paper for the first time ever. And she worked at a beauty parlor, actually. She wasn't a full-time singer. She worked at a beauty parlor. And I called her at the beauty parlor, and I took her out for dinner and gave her a copy of this Melody Maker. And we've been friends ever since.
And she asked you to manage the band, didn't she?
Yeah. A little late. Well, I think shortly after that, I took Debbie to see The Who at Madison Square Garden. And she was sort of my date. And I went backstage because I knew The Who really well then, and everyone that worked for them. And I think this must have impressed her that I was on such good terms with The Who and the management and Ron Dalzler, who promoted the concerts there. So she probably thought that I was a good bet to manage Blondie. But it didn't happen straight away. There was a bit of a time lapse because the Stilettos split up, and then her and Chris Stein put Blondie together. And then she approached me, Chris and her approached me to manage them, but I couldn't do it.
It would require a load of skills that
I didn't have.
A rock
Also,
hack from the Melody Maker wouldn't have.
My presence in America was contingent on working for Melody Maker.
Yeah.
I'd have had to leave. I couldn't manage a band and be a music writer at the same time, especially in America,
Yeah.
So I had to turn them down, unfortunately. But they've stayed friends. They've never forgot that very early coverage that I gave them. And
that's really good.
I think.
Very impressive.
The very first, yeah.
There's a bit where you talk about walking with Keith Moon. You're going through a crowd, and the crowd kind of parting as he walks through. And it's a really interesting description. And I can remember moments of being with certain rock stars and getting an idea of what the world looked like through their eyes.
Yeah.
But I never felt any envy for any of them. I never ever thought I would exchange my life with yours, because I could see how difficult the world was and how difficult it was to maintain a reputation. How did you feel about that?
I think the rock stuff, I'd like to be someone who wasn't very well known facially. I sometimes envy somehow, like the bass player in Coldplay, right?
Yeah.
No one really knows who he is. Everybody knows who Chris Martin is, But to be someone who's a little bit, who's making the kind of money and getting there, but then they can slink away into the background. I think that's what the Pink Floyd wanted to be like, because
John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin is a good example of that. I occasionally see him in my local supermarket, and nobody apart from me has the faintest idea who he is.
I know. When a long time after Melody Maker, when I worked at Omnibus Press, which was part of music sales, music publishers, we actually published John Paul Jones's sheet music beyond Led Zeppelin.
Oh, yeah.
And he came into the office every now and then. And no one knew who he was apart from me. And I'd see John Paul waiting in our reception. And he'd tell me he'd come up on the tube. He lived in Mortlake, I think, somewhere, doesn't he? Down there on Barnes Way, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And he said he'd come up on the tube, and no one knew who the hell he was.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about, it's quite interesting because you're not a kind of personality columnist type writer. You're just a reporter, and you're doing a job and you're reporting whatever needs reporting on. So it's underground and it's kind of overground. And at one point you are covering people like the Osmonds and the Bay City Rollers.
Yeah.
And you described in the book that the Bay City Rollers experience was the nearest thing to a nightmare I've ever had while being awake. So explain why that was.
That was at Boston Airport, I think. The Bay City Rollers were very popular in America, although, nothing compared to the Beatles, and nothing in terms of numbers, but there was a lot of screaming girls were enthused about them. And on this particular occasion, I'd gone to, I think, Boston and somewhere else on the East Coast to do a story about how they were getting on in America. And the police in Boston or the airport authority had declined to allow their car or limousine, whatever it was, to pull up alongside the plane so as they could just, come down the stairs and get into the car and out of the airport, right? They'd insisted for some reason or other that they had to walk through the airport where a radio station had announced the time of their arrival. And about 2,000 or 3,000 screaming girls, all aged between sort of 10 and 15, had turned up at this airport, and the role of security was inadequate, and there were insufficient policemen there. They had to dash from the incoming gate, arrivals area, through the airport, out the front, and into these cars that were waiting for them. And all these girls were there. And
somehow they wouldn't quite have been the Rollers had there not been a kind of riot at the airport. That's the kind of point.
Normally, they tentatively take care of this thing by allowing them to get straight in the car off the plane. You see, but on this occasion, they hadn't. And and the problem was these girls dressed like the Bay City Rollers. Now, the policeman assigned to the airport that day couldn't tell
difference between a fan and a member of the band.
The fans from the group. They all look the same.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there was absolute chaos it was. And I saw this myself. It was the nearest thing to a nightmare. So fortunately, I didn't look like a roller. I was older and I wasn't that, so I could just observe it. But I wondered who would tell limb from limb on that occasion. And one of them, the youngest one, I think his name was Ian Mitchell, was the police thought he was a fan and chucked him back into the fans, right? This poor little boy, he was a little boy, about 16, 17, looked as though he's going to be torn limb from limb. And I actually watched all this. I thought, this is crazy, it's a real wonder no one was...
It would be subject of numerous lawsuits now, I'm sure.
But I covered all those kind of acts, and I write about them in the book, The Osmonds, and David Cassidy as well.
Yeah,
and there was a fatality at a David Cassidy show, wasn't there? As a result of this fanaticism. I mean, from a musical point of view, the Bay City Rollers were like an average cabaret band in a nightclub in anywhere you care to name. They were pretty useless. They didn't play on their records or write most of them, of course. But
we didn't expect them to.
But like you said, I was a reporter. Yeah, I think all of us on Melody Maker, we had to cover everything.
Yeah,
the stuff we liked and the stuff we didn't necessarily like, but realized that because it was a phenomenon, we had to cover it.
Yeah. When you finished, I think you left Melody Maker about 1977, and you'd been in America all that time, living on the West Coast and East Coast.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been quite hard to adjust to kind of, I suppose, normal life in a sense. Did you kind of feel, I will never get a job like that again?
No, that's true. I stayed in America, actually, after I left Melody Maker. I resigned in February 1977, and I resigned because Ray Coleman wanted to bring me back to the UK. And I knew that it would be a real come down working back in London, especially as Melody Maker's offices were now on Maymont Street in prefabricated buildings.
That's right.
As opposed to the rather nice offices we had on Fleet Street. And I thought, this is going to be such a letdown, is this, back in the UK. And before I'd left, I'd been the news editor, and the news editor's job had gone to someone else. So I'd gone to Ron Partridge, as it happened. And I thought, I'm just going to be another dog's body on the paper. And from traveling around with Led Zeppelin, I'm going to be interviewing, I don't know, Eggs Over Easy in the Nashville or something, Not that there's anything wrong.
Nothing wrong with that.
Bob Rock was, but you can see that it wasn't quite the same thing. So I resigned, and I got a job working in New York for a company that managed rock bands for a while. But then eventually I came back to the UK. But but I didn't want to leave America. One of the other things, and I touch on this in the book, that there was this kind of ephemeral nature of this job, because I knew that any day Ray Coleman, the boss, could ring me up and say, "Come home tomorrow."
Yeah.
So you couldn't set
no security.
You couldn't. There's no security. You couldn't like set down roots, as it were, and this had a dramatic effect on my personal life, because it meant that I couldn't have a girlfriend.
Yeah.
I could, but I couldn't have a permanent one, because I might suddenly have to say to her, "Sorry, darling, we've got to go back to London with me," and she might not want to. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So it was a very odd kind of a job. It was wonderful in some respects, but it wasn't helpful to your private life doing this. But I loved it all the same. And
do you miss, when you look back at that, do you miss the role the music press played? Because it's interesting, I mean, having been in the press a long time myself, there was a sense that even uninteresting musicians could be made into larger-than-life, cartoon-like characters, and everybody was given a kind of personality, and everybody was made into a kind of supercharged, an entertaining individual. And I guess there just isn't very much of that now. Most of the publicity put out by particular musicians is often through their own agency, really. It's their own Instagram and their own X posts, and I miss that three-dimensional sense that journalists made.
I think you're right. It's because the music industry has become institutionalized now.
Yeah.
It was relatively young when I was working on and it was exciting. Because it was young, and it was exciting because of the immediacy, like I touched on earlier, about how the acts put out a lot more records, a lot one after the other than they do now. But you're right, we had a job on Melody Maker almost to big people up, because if we bigged them up, then people were more likely to buy Melody Maker, I think.
Yeah.
Certainly, we when I was news editor, I was charged with finding something dramatic to put on the front page when nothing dramatic was happening. So we didn't make stuff up, as it were. But one of our favorite stories, I touch on this, was Beatles to Reform. Now because I started just after the Beatles had broken up, then Beatles to Reform was a big story, even though it never happened and never would. But that doesn't alter the fact that it'll sell a newspaper, just like politicians who lie, but their lies are plastered all over the right-wing press. Well, we weren't really lying; we were just speculating.
But I would be tempted to put a top right-hand splash every week saying "Beatles to Reform?" Question mark. Will the Beatles reform? See page 4. See page 4. No, they won't.
Yeah. Led Zeppelin split, even though they hadn't.
That's right. I know.
I know. So I was, and Ray Coleman would say, "Chris, we've got to find a front page lead. What are we going to do, right? Who's in the charts this week? Free." So, Free Mania grips the nation,
I can still remember Ray Coleman's headlines: Wings, Metal Fatigue, and Bay City Bonkers.
I know. It was
really old school.
There was also Alan Lewis as well. I don't know if you knew Alan, but Alan was fantastic at his droll headlines. One of my favorites, and I'm not sure quite how far we should go on your podcast, but it's for grown-ups after all, isn't it? There was a picture of Barry White, and the story was that Barry White was about to arrive in the UK for a series of dates. So we found a photograph of Barry White, and he was on stage performing, and he was perspiring. He was a stout man, wasn't he?
I'm bracing myself for this, whatever it is.
Barry White coming. That was it. Think about it.
Oh my Lord!
You might want to cut that out.
And there we have it. Yeah. But look, it's very interesting reading it, and it's funny. It's a bit like a kind of period drama now, or a historical reenactment, and with the job of the rock critic kind of going the way of the lamplighter and the watch-mender. I think your book will be seen in years to come as a kind of historical document, actually.
Well,
anyway, it's called Just Backdated.
I try to tell it like it was. As you know, I don't try to gild the lily at all in it, and every story is 100% true. I think it's just this access we had to everybody. I saw Springsteen a year and a half before Born to Run came out, and I was staying in the same hotel as him. and I had breakfast with him, but he didn't want to do an interview, so I didn't bother. But I didn't want to, intrude on his privacy when he was having his breakfast. But I thought he was fantastic, and so there's stories like that in the book that when I encountered people before they were famous. Elton the same. First time I saw him was he was long before Your Song, well, 6 months before Your Song was a hit, and I thought this guy's going to be big one day, and I wrote that in the paper, and he was. And again, Elton was very gentleman. He was always very gracious to me.
Well, you never forget people who gave you publicity when you really needed it.
Exactly, when you really needed it. And I did that with Debbie, and I did that with Elton, and I did that with Bruce. But so lots of people were writing nice things about Bruce as well. No, it was a wonderful time, and I look back on it really fondly now because because of what I did during those 7 years, sort of established the pattern for the rest of my life. So if I'd never, got the job in the first place in June of 1970, I wouldn't have gone on to run Omnibus Press later.
Well, it brought back a lot of memories for me, and I reading it kind of just reminded of what magazine offices were like in the 70s, the kind of rattle of typewriters, the constant ringing of phones, scent of cigarettes, people pouring back from a pub in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's all there.
We all went to the pub.
Copy of Just Backdated by Chris Charlesworth. And Chris, it's lovely to talk to you again.